Welcome, everyone. I'll give it just a few more seconds for folks to join. All right, it looks like most people have joined now. Hello and welcome to today's Climate Adaptations and Futures webinar. My name is Carlin Vossen and I'm from the Colorado Resiliency Office in the Department of Local Affairs. And today marks our 10th webinar in the monthly climate series. We've covered a very wide range of topics, and the recordings and presentations from all of the webinars are available on the CRO website if you'd like to check those out. Today, we're going to be talking about natural working lands. And just a few quick reminders before we get started. You can use the chat to communicate any questions or comments to all attendees. And if you need to send something just to the panelists, you can use the Q&A feature. You're all muted, your mic is muted. And this webinar is recorded just as the previous ones were, and it will be posted on the CRO website as well. At the end of the session. So now I'd like to turn it over to Angela Boag from the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. She's the Assistant Director for Climate, Forest, Health, and Energy, and she'll be presenting today as well as moderating the session and the Q&A at the end. So I'll turn it over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Carlin, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could all attend today's conversation about natural and working lands and natural climate solutions in Colorado. And as Carlin said, I'm the Assistant Director for Climate, Forest, Health, and Energy at the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, which means that I get to think about climate change in a very broad sense across DNR's programs, and that includes thinking about the opportunities for our natural and working lands to play a role in terms of natural climate solutions to help us mitigate the impacts of climate change, and in many cases simultaneously help both communities and ecosystems adapt. And I will introduce our subsequent speakers as we go forward. So next slide. So today I really just wanted to provide a quick overview of natural and working lands policy as it currently stands in Colorado. You know, I will preface this presentation by saying that natural climate solutions, in terms of recognizing them as climate solutions, it's still a relatively new policy approach for the state. And I'll dig into a little bit of the synergies between, I think, existing programs and really a new policy approach as I go forward. But before I get started, I want to define a few terms, because I know that you know, many of you on this call may know a lot about natural climate solutions, be very familiar, while others, you know, this may be a small part of your portfolio, or even just something that you are interested in and you really have not had an opportunity to dig into these concepts. So, you know, when we talk about natural and working lands, we are talking about forests, farms, and other agricultural production areas, rangelands, grasslands, urban green space, and wetlands. And the potential for all of those lands, both natural lands and working lands, to be both sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, when wildfires burn, they emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, as well as opportunities to be carbon sinks. So, you know, our forests and our grasslands absorb CO2 as trees and plants grow, and therefore could also play a role in reducing, you know, the total amount of CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere and are playing a role in warming our planet. So to go to then natural climate solutions, you know, what does that mean? It really means any actions in terms of conservation, restoration, or improved land management that increase carbon storage or avoid greenhouse gas emissions in landscapes. And so, when we think about natural climate solutions for Colorado, I think it's important to note that natural and working lands have the potential to sequester a portion of Colorado's greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors. So for example, from the power sector, from our buildings, from oil and gas, from transportation. But this ability to sequester greenhouse gas emissions really varies widely by land potential. So how productive lands are, it varies by season, it varies by year due to wildfire behavior, dynamics of forest insects and disease, drought conditions. So, I think this is just a really important point to emphasize because while I think there's a lot of really exciting potential for our natural and working lands to play a really important role in addressing climate change, I think we need to remember that these are living and breathing ecosystems that experience disturbances or different management approaches, and they may not necessarily be sort of guaranteed long-term solutions, and there are things that require sort of constant management. So the state of Colorado established a natural and working lands task force within state government back in the winter of 2020. And this followed the state of Colorado and really the governor signed on to a natural and working lands challenge with an organization called the U.S. Climate Alliance. And the Climate Alliance is really an alliance of states who are really pushing state policy to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and international agreements around emissions reduction and addressing climate change more broadly. So we established this interagency task force of state staff really to think about how to promote voluntary reduction, primarily of greenhouse gas emissions, and restore, protect, and enhance carbon sequestration across all natural and working lands in Colorado. And so the primary agencies making up that task force are the Colorado Department of Agriculture, as well as staff from the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, but we do bring in others from other state agencies as is relevant, and also have technical experts from various organizations who support us. So next slide. And so, to remind us of sort of where state climate policy is at, because, for local governments, I'm sure this is something you're tracking as you think about your own local government's goals. Colorado has passed some major climate legislation really in the last 3 years. A lot of it started with HB 19-1261, which was really the first state legislation to establish clear emissions reduction goals for the state of Colorado. As well as several bills that focused on ensuring a more robust greenhouse gas inventory and reporting requirements for that inventory. So again, just a few highlights of legislation over the last few years. We had a requirement put in place to establish a greenhouse gas inventory with a 2005 baseline. We also now have these goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 26% below 2005 levels by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% below 2005 levels by 2050. And as part of that, the state really committed to developing rules and policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One example is a goal that the state has to create a regulatory pathway for electric utilities to meet an 80% greenhouse gas reduction goal below 2005 levels by 2030. So that's just one example from another sector. And the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment really plays in many ways the strongest regulatory role on climate in the state. They are the ones who are requiring annual tracking and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and have several rulemakings that have occurred or are occurring that require emissions reductions from certain sectors. Next slide. So again, as I said, the state has these emissions reduction goals. The state then developed a greenhouse gas emissions roadmap, and I'll speak a little bit more to that in the next slide. But the roadmap required, the state to bring on consultants. Oh, previous slide, actually, sorry, Carlin. The state brought on consultants to do modeling to basically figure out how the state could achieve these emission reduction goals. And this graph here just shows, the reference line at the top is this is economy-wide emissions by various scenarios. The reference line is just statewide greenhouse gas emissions if we chose to do nothing based on 2019 policies that were in place, or sorry, pre-2019, so 2018 and before. The yellow line shows where we would get to just enacting 2019 state policies. And you also see those dotted lines denoting impacts of COVID, the modeled impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. And then that red line is really the trajectory of our emissions that the state has to hit to achieve our goals under HB 191261, and specifically that goal for 90% below 2005 levels by 2050. So it's a steep reduction. I hope that's clear. All right, next slide. So this is a timeline. I won't spend very long on it, but really it just lays out the process by which the state of Colorado developed the greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. So again, HB 191261 really set that whole process in motion. State agencies began meeting in 2019 and winter of 2020 to develop the greenhouse gas inventory to fulfill that piece of our commitments. And I think an important note on the natural and working land side is that both agriculture and forests are represented in our state's emissions inventory currently in some specific ways. And I'm happy to get in touch with anyone on the call who wants to dig into the inventory and look at those specific emissions that are captured by the inventory. It is certainly not comprehensive and is primarily based off of the EPA's state inventory tool for those two land cover land use types. Again, through 2020, there was stakeholder engagement on the greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap, and it was delivered to the Air Quality Control Commission in the fall of that year. And the next slide, Carlin. And then finally, in January of this past year, we published the greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. So this is really the state's blueprint for emissions reductions. Okay, next slide. So what does the roadmap mean for natural and working lands? Recognizing that it is really, the state's primary visioning document and policy document on greenhouse gas reduction. So the roadmap includes several near-term actions that the state is committed to for natural and working lands. The first is to work to refine the natural and working lands emissions inventory that is currently represented at the state level. As I said, it's not comprehensive, and new technology, new science could potentially be integrated to make it more comprehensive. And then also to develop a natural and working lands strategic plan with stakeholder feedback. So we have actually been hosting some listening sessions for the public this summer as we scope the natural and working land strategic plan, and I can put the link to those signups in the chat after I'm finished here. Our plan for natural and working lands, it really focuses on voluntary and incentive-based approaches at this stage. So for instance, for the Colorado Department of Agriculture, that's really focusing on improving soil function and carbon sequestration through regenerative farming practices, which includes supporting participation by producers in efforts such as field to market, the soil health partnership, and precision agriculture programs. And they have a new soil health program now in place to support producers with this work. The roadmap does contain one quantitative emissions reduction goal for natural and working lands, and that is in agriculture. So we are aiming to reduce agricultural soil emissions by 1 million metric tons by 2030. But thus far, that's the only quantitative emissions reduction goal for natural and working lands that we have at the state. So next slide. All right. Well, that wraps it up for me. I, again, will put my contact information and the information for those scoping sessions in the chat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Menges, who's the Sustainability Programs Administrator with the City of Aspen, to lead you through some of the work that they did as a local government that I think will be really informative for how other local governments may want to tackle this issue. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Angela. I am going to share my screen. Carlin, I don't know if we need to stop sharing yours. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited that you can join us. My name is Chris Menges. I'm joined by Erin Glen, who you will hear from in a moment. And we're here representing an informal collaborative of stakeholders from the Roaring Fork Valley and watershed and beyond that have been working together on exploring sequestration and natural climate solutions, which I'll refer to as NCS. And the primary purpose of our presentation and what we want to share with you is to really brief you on how we've been exploring NCS as a collective in the watershed, both our stakeholder engagement approach and our technical research. We hope that this will give you a sense of the scale of our watershed's carbon stock based on our research and demonstrate one novel research methodology for estimating that. So to get there, we're just going to kind of touch on what we've done and why, maybe spend a majority of our time sharing our research and process findings. So those are both the quantitative, the actual carbon, and then some of the implications and recommendations, which have been stakeholder driven and informed by that data. I'll also share a little bit about where we are now and where we might be going as a group. So this is an overview of the process we've taken over the past year as we've explored NCS in our region. And it's a good opportunity to just touch on why we're doing this. And to break it down simply, we have many organizations in the region that are doing amazing work in the conservation space, in the ag space, in open space management, and in climate mitigation. And based on individual conversations we were having with a lot of these partners, it became clear that many were interested in exploring the level to which their work provides land-based carbon benefits and whether their practices could be adapted in any way or enhanced to protect carbon stocks, to increase sequestration, or to increase a lot of the complementary benefits. So on the climate team at the city, our office saw an opportunity to pull this diverse group of partners together to explore the landscape, assemble questions, tap expertise, and define some possible action pathways. So I'll dip a little bit into our process. I realize many attendees are likely really experienced in running and participating processes, and you don't need a deep dive on ours, but I just wanted to share some highlights from some of the key stages. So during our kickoff meeting, the purpose was really to hear from regional stakeholders about their knowledge and interest. And during that meeting, we kind of went through key concepts and examples, and those were some of the things that Angela just covered. What came out of that was a lot of ideas on opportunities and possible next steps for what NCS could look like in this region. And using all that feedback, we created this feedback map, which I'm happy to share. It contains a lot of ideas on specific activities. It kind of defined some of the main sectors we might be working in. But some of the overarching themes that came out of the kickoff meeting were that there really is significant interest in our region in NCS from a variety of stakeholders in different management areas. And that an immediate opportunity would be to get a sense for our valley's existing natural carbon storage, opportunities to protect and enhance it, and additional sequestration potential. To that end, what we heard from the group in terms of next steps was that it wanted additional data and insights to determine whether regional sequestration efforts really merited ongoing consideration and inquiry. And importantly, we also heard that if we could begin answering some of those questions, stakeholders thought that insights would be policy relevant, meaning that NCS and sequestration could be integrated into planning and policy decisions at the local and regional level if we had a good handle on it. With that feedback, we spent some time with leads from each subgroup. Subgroups were federal and state lands, county and city lands, and agricultural and private lands. And they helped us shape a research direction. And I'm sharing this slide both to acknowledge their work, but also to show just the sampling of a variety of the partners we had involved in the bigger collaborative. So in just this small group of subgroup leads, we had folks representing federal, county, and city government, agriculture, land trusts, and NGOs with focus areas from energy to conservation to education. So our subgroup leads provided a lot of input to then inform the analysis and mapping work that you're going to hear about from Erin in a moment. Before passing it on to her, I just want to acknowledge her work. You know, she took real ownership and initiative on this project and kind of used best practices to create a novel but informative approach. And what is really an amazing resource for our region. This April, we presented the research I'm about to share with you and its big picture takeaways to stakeholders from throughout the valley and the watershed, to participants from our group and from adjacent counties. And we asked them to consider the info and use what we're about to present to you to help us determine next steps. So I'll circle back to that, but with that, I'll pass it over to Erin to cover the research, and then I will close us out.
Thank you, Chris. Just going to share my screen. All right, so hello everyone. So the purpose of this research project was to provide a preliminary analysis of carbon stocks and flux, carbon stewardship, and drivers of change in order to help guide future research and policy priorities for stakeholders across our watershed. So the primary questions I sought out to answer were how much carbon is stored as carbon stocks, how much net carbon is removed each year, or carbon flux, the net sum of emissions and removals, and what entities are responsible for managing these carbon stores. Where are carbon stocks highly protected or at risk of degradation, and how are these dynamics changing over time? So to understand these dynamics in the Roaring Fork watershed, I analyzed the land cover change that occurred from 2006 to 2016, and then used these trends to project potential change from 2016 to 2026. I then applied estimates of carbon flux by land cover type taken from the literature to extrapolate flux and the change in flux from land cover change. And what I found was that in general, land cover change was not very significant in the Roaring Fork watershed from 06 to 16. However, the greatest areas of change that we saw were in gains and losses of shrubland and forest, as well as gains in agricultural lands. Our net changes were largest in positive changes in agricultural lands and developed lands, as well as losses in shrublands. And I think it's important to note the difference between gains and losses and net changes. So a high gain and loss resulting in a low net change does not necessarily indicate stability. And preserving intact ecosystems is considered to be more effective in limiting emissions from land cover change and protecting biodiversity. So although we see a low net change in forests, the fact that we are seeing gains and losses indicates emission causing land cover change. So for example, cutting down an acre of forest in one parcel and replanting in another parcel is not as ideal as preserving the original intact forest. And to break down the resultant change in carbon flux further, I analyzed the data by land manager and found that city lands showed the highest % increase in sequestration, which means that the net change, the net exchange of carbon became more negative as a % of the class total. State and federal lands showed the highest % losses in sequestration, meaning that these management categories experienced shifts away from more carbon-rich land cover types. Private lands showed the highest overall increase in sequestration, so not as a percentage of the class total, but rather as a raw measurement of metric tons of carbon. Based on land cover alone, we're seeing a very slight increase in carbon being sequestered over both the 06 to 16 and 16 to 26 periods. And this is consistent with the trends predicted for Colorado overall by a comprehensive 2017 study. And however, this same study also predicts a reversal of these trends in which carbon sequestration begins to diminish each year by 2030. Furthermore, our estimates do not account for the emissions caused by the land cover change process and only look at the flux of the new state of land post-change, which also brings me to talk about some other factors at play. I think it's important to point out that the projections of land cover change for 16 to 26 rely on linear assumptions, and do not account for some potentially significant changes in the drivers of land cover change. So for example, recent wildfires like Lake Christine, which are expected to increase in severity and frequency, ecological succession due to climatic shift, increased development pressures, and disturbance or degradation from drought, insects, and disease. These are all really important factors to account for and should be further investigated and considered in the trajectory of carbon stocks and fluxes across the state. So to provide a glimpse into the effects of land cover change drivers, I ran a simulation of what kinds of impacts disturbances like the Lake Christine fire can have on overall carbon sequestration. To do so, I quantified the land cover classes within the burn perimeter and applied our flux values to both the baseline land cover and a hypothetical post-fire recovery scenario. And what I found was that even after some recovery, this event could reduce annual sequestration in the perimeter by 3,300 metric tons of carbon. That's 43% of the total sequestration in the area and 1% of the overall sequestration across the watershed. So 1% is a pretty significant number when we consider the estimated changes in overall flux over a decade were about 0.06%. And I think this example highlights how the balance of carbon fluxes in the watershed and across the state could shift dramatically due to anthropogenic and natural pressures in the coming years, and really emphasizes the need to explore preservation and enhancement of carbon sinks via protection and natural climate solutions practices. Fortunately, some organizations in the Valley are taking on this task already. The Aspen Valley Land Trust has acquired a beautiful 141-acre ranch outside of Carbondale, thus sparing this area from subdivision and development. And the diversity of land cover and use on this property provides some really unique opportunities for implementing and monitoring NCS practices. The Land Trust has said that they plan to implement soil improvement, regenerative agriculture, and wetland restoration, to name a few, and to conduct carbon content soil sampling to measure the impacts of these practices. There's also potential to make the site available for field study by regional universities. And projects like these can serve as really important case studies and proxies for estimating the potential impacts of various NCS practices when implemented at a larger scale. To give a general idea of how these practices might impact carbon fluxes on Coffin Ranch, I conducted a simulation of a few potential practices based on the land cover within the area. And as you can see, the ranch holds a significant area of agricultural lands and wetlands, and at baseline, the majority of carbon sequestration comes from these wetlands. Based on these estimates, applying 3 NCS practices could increase the estimated flux of the area by 2%. And this is again a significant figure when we consider the scale of changes happening naturally. And I also estimated that 68% of this enhancement could be achieved through wetland restoration on this property. Additionally, I ran some course simulations of the impacts that various NCS practices could have when implemented at scale in the watershed. For forest improvement practices, I isolated forests on public multi-use lands as a study area. For agricultural practices, I looked at agricultural lands within private management. And for wetland restoration, the target was 25% of wetlands across the watershed. And I realize these are some ambitious targets, but just wanted to give a sense of the possibility. Some key takeaways from this analysis were that forest improvement could increase carbon stocks on public multi-use lands by 20% over 10 years. However, implementation across public multi-use lands may not be realistic. One, because these forests may already be in improved condition, and 2, because of the scale of implementation. However, switching from synthetic fertilizer to compost, which has a relatively low cost of implementation and a ton of associated benefits, could also have a significant impact in increasing carbon stocks on private ag lands by 3%. Wetlands restoration on 25% of watershed wetlands could increase overall carbon stocks by 4%. And the co-benefits here are really extensive in terms of hydrological regulation, protection of biodiversity, and climate resilience. So in summary, there is significant potential in preserving, enhancing lands to maximize carbon sequestration while protecting ecosystem services. And I think there's a lot of potential in investigating these options further. And now I'm going to pass it back to Chris for some key takeaways.
Thanks so much, Erin. Okay, I just wanted to close us out with a quick kind of recap and provide some of the key takeaways and some possible planning and policy connections that our stakeholders identified using some of that information. So starting off with the federal and state lands group, Erin's research made pretty clear that most of our carbon stock and maintaining carbon dioxide removals happens in forests and woodlands on federal and state lands. Big picture, this means our best opportunity is to protect intact ecosystems and prevent conversion of higher carbon stock land cover types to lower ones. So far, we haven't seen much change or conversion, but we also know that this doesn't consider our rapid increase in fire frequency and intensity. So that's something to look out for. Specific policy ideas that our group came up with include partnering with and encouraging federal and state land management agencies to account for carbon stocks and sequestration in policy and management decisions, and to consider carbon sequestration in wildfire mitigation and restoration activities. So when we look at the land conversion that has occurred in the watershed, most has been from shrubland to cropland, and this has some specific implications for the agriculture and private land sector. One idea here is that landowners, managers, and decision makers could prioritize sequestration and related benefits like healthy soils, water stewardship, protection of habitat, and enhanced climate resilience, especially in ag lands. A way to do that would be continuing to evaluate these types of opportunities and support their implementation through policy and incentives. And then, as we saw in the presentation, county and city lands are also relatively small in geographic scale, but they're very important because they can store a relatively significant amount of carbon per acre. We also know that city and county managed open spaces face some potentially unprecedented development pressure and could be more prone to conversion than in the past. One recommendation is to begin quantifying terrestrial carbon data and integrating it into our greenhouse gas inventories and climate mitigation and resilience plans at the local government level. Looking at the data in this way has raised some questions about how we should be utilizing it. On the one hand, sequestration could help us reach zero emission goals at the community scale. On the other hand, as Angela mentioned in the beginning, we should really be prioritizing reducing activity-based emissions to zero while also actively working on NCS, both for its climate benefits, but also for its primary and associated benefits. One thing our group thought could be a good fit for the city and county lands group is to develop a best practice guide for the types of management activities and decisions being made on city and county lands. And something like this could rank activities by climate benefits along with the other criteria or benefits that managers and decision makers consider. So using all of this information and more, we presented a larger version of what Erin just shared with you to our full set of stakeholders, and each working group then provided us with a lot of additional feedback in 4 different kind of action categories. Those are up on the screen here. We can share this document, but it basically means that coming out of our recent large meeting in April 2021, we have a fair number of next step ideas for necessary additional research, tools that could help begin implementing NCS in each of the sectors, additional policy and program ideas, and then kind of tactical ideas on how to move forward. One thing that we continue to hear from stakeholders was that a collective regional approach to developing and implementing NCS pathways was welcomed. And moving forward, we plan to continue collaborating as a collective. So that's it for our project. Before passing it over to Tim, I just wanted to mention that ours was we're relatively early on. We took a novel approach. There are some communities and initiatives that are much further along in specific areas, and even that have developed tools and frameworks that others can use. Just wanted to share one. This is the Urban Drawdown Initiative. It's chaired by Brett Kencairn of Boulder County, and it's an organized collective of several local governments and technical partners that have developed frameworks and tools that other communities can tap into. Thanks so much, and I look forward to hearing from Tim.
Thank you, Chris and Angela and Carlin. My name is Tim Sullivan. I'm the Natural Climate Solutions Director for the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council based in Steamboat Springs. I'm going to talk to you today about the way we've been approaching natural and working lands and land use as a sector and a climate action plan for Routt County that's been approved recently by the county and by the city of Steamboat Springs and by the incorporated townships in the county as well, just in the last few months. I also will close with an example of what action looks like as we're moving forward with this. So I won't go back into the overview on what are natural climate solutions, but again, they're really focused on protecting, restoring, and better management of lands, and then thinking about how those can contribute to either a resilience or adaptation goal, as well as carbon sequestration. The Yampa Valley Sustainability Council created this Natural Climate Solutions program just this year, really in response to the efforts that have been going on by the county, by Routt County, to develop a climate action plan. Our goal, and this is an interesting opportunity, I think, for all local governments, is to work with the non-governmental organizations that can help advance those same principles and goals by working with local government partners, other NGO partners, other federal agency and state agency partners to build capacity and consensus and collaboration around what climate solutions can look for. So I very much see my role as helping the governments achieve these overall vision for the climate action plan, and thinking about how I can do that coming from the nonprofit sector, particularly through fundraising and consensus building and capacity. Next slide. So Routt County, as I mentioned, just and the communities within it just approved this climate action plan in the last few months. It's a little different than many other county level climate action plans in that it does include a very specific focus on the land use sector as one of the areas for action, in addition to the traditional ones such as energy and transportation and waste management. And in the land use sector, the plan identified 4 big areas that sort of fall within the purview of local government. One is to promote land management practices to improve and restore that I mentioned before of land. The second is to sort of think about how do we work across sectors. This is particularly important in a rural county like Routt County with a significant amount of public land, as Chris and Erin just talked about. The importance of how do you work with the federal government that owns quite a bit of the land in our counties is important. I think this is true even in counties and areas that don't have that federal ownership, but the idea of working across public and private land is important. The third is thinking about how water conservation fits in both as a climate adaptation strategy, but also as a way to reduce energy use through treatment and delivery. And the fourth is a function on land use and growth and development and land protection. Next slide. With those strategies, those big 4 strategies, the action plan breaks it down into specific steps. I won't go through all of these, and then there are tactics underneath them. The plan is available either at the City of Steamboat Springs or the Routt County websites. But it's thinking about where are the roles for local government to think about land use and its impact on climate through the kinds of decisions it makes, but also the kinds of partnerships it makes. You know, thinking about how do you work on either city or county owned lands to restore natural systems, How do you work with the Forest Service and other entities on how do you manage forests better for both wildfire mitigation, but also climate resiliency going forward? How do you drive your open space acquisition program that the county has a significant role in here through a purchase of development rights program to target lands that would be important for these kinds of natural climate solutions? And then how do you continue to manage the way we use water, and particularly in the municipal and industrial sector, and how do we do future planning? Very interesting case study that we hopefully are going to have here in Routt County, as many of you may have heard, just had a very significant donation of more than 500 acres of land to the local housing authority to build workforce housing, with a very clear focus on let's build this as a sustainable contribution to the community that helps us achieve our climate goals. So it's really going to be interesting to see how we can bring all of these ideas into an actual development proposal controlled by a housing authority. Next slide, please. And then we've begun a discussion about what does this look like? What are the land use opportunities that make the most sense for Routt County? This is very similar. You heard a lot of these from Chris and Erin. You know, we're avoiding the conversion of natural lands that are particularly rich in carbon is a very, very important and the most important thing we can be doing at local government. Thinking about what is happening with wildfire on our landscapes is critical, and it's not just reducing fuel loads, but it's doing it in a way that's carbon friendly. I think I saw one question come up in the chat about, can we do something more with the wood we're taking out of forests rather than just burning it or letting it burn? And I think that's an important question. Can we use wood in a way that sequesters carbon, either in construction or more likely in other products like biochar, which helps hold that carbon in place? Can we regenerate more quickly our forests after they have burned or that have been lost to other other forces? Focusing on riparian restoration, particularly in places like Routt County that have significant riverways, and I'm going to talk about an example in that project. How do we work with grazing lands, which is the main agricultural use here in Routt County, hayfields and grazing lands, which is a little different than a lot of the focus that Angela mentioned from the state of Colorado, which is a lot on row crops. But are there ways to increase carbon sequestration within the grazing operations, both in grazing management and in things like agroforestry projects? And then protecting and restoring wetlands everywhere, I think, is a key focus in going forward. So next slide. I'm going to give you a brief example of a project that's already underway that meets a lot of these goals. I think is the way it gives a good example of how you can think about this through a local government lens. This is the Yampa River. Anyone that's been to Steamboat or Routt County knows how much it defines us up here. It is the center of the community. People understand it. It runs through urban and rural parts of the county. And it's compared to most rivers in Colorado, in relatively good condition, but it has its challenges. The picture on the left of the screen is the cottonwood gallery forest that we would like to see along the river, that you do find in many stretches below the town of Steamboat, whereas the image on the right shows what's a more typical stretch through and above town, where you've had land clearing right up to the river's edge. You don't have that gallery forest. You do have some riparian vegetation, but not the kind of vegetation that can protect the river. Next slide. The city of Steamboat Springs about 3 years ago did a really comprehensive health assessment of the river and looked at what its condition was, but also what we could do about it. There are 3 components of this report that are important for what we're doing now. That's the water quality indicator here, which is impacted due to increased temperature of the water. This is a cold water fishery, but the temperatures in it often exceed the tolerances and the state standards for a cold water fishery. floodplain connectivity, whereas how likely is the river to move out of its banks in a way that is healthy for the river and inundates natural areas, and that's low in many stretches of this. And finally, the riparian condition, as I showed on the other side. So those are three of the key impairments that the city and the county and environmental groups in the area have said we need to address. And fortunately, there's a good way to help fix those that accomplish a number of other goals and relate to natural climate solutions. So next slide, please. Following from that health assessment, the city of Steamboat Springs, along with my organization, the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council and the Colorado State Forest Service, identified the opportunity to increase the trees along the river in a way that provided shade, sequestered carbon, improved wildlife habitat to address those impacts that I mentioned from the stream management plan, but also helped address climate challenges, particularly the increased temperature of the river and the need for additional carbon sequestration. The Yampa Valley Sustainability Council has been running a program called ReTree for the last 12 years, which is a community tree planting effort. And in the last few years, we turned it to focus on how do we get to the point where we can restore forests along the large stretches of the Yampa River to address these goals. The shade will help us in the future. It's already a challenge. The water temperature in the river is already a challenge today, but going forward, we can do much better if we increase the amount of forest along the river in places that have lost it or have a degraded riparian condition. As I mentioned before, this creates multi-benefits. It both helps sequester carbon, but also helps with a key adaptation strategy of the increased temperature of the river. Cottonwoods and riparian forests generally in Colorado are probably the best place for us to rapidly increase carbon sequestration in forests because they grow so quickly. And whereas most of our other forests are more arid, the riparian forest by definition should have more moisture in them and therefore sequester carbon more quickly. To really have an impact here, and this is a message about natural climate solutions generally, is you need to do it at scale. Today, we've just been working on a couple of acres of trying to figure out how to do this and get there. The goal would be to do 10 miles or 15 miles of river restoration with increased forest canopy. That will have a major impact on carbon sequestration in the county, and also will have a very significant impact on the amount of temperature loading in the river. The other advantage of tree planting generally, especially in an urban setting, is that it is definitely a way to engage the community and doing something that they feel good about, taking climate action and trying to solve problems. And next slide, please. Using this as an example, one of the reasons I think that it's important for local governments to think about how these natural and working lands, natural climate solutions projects can work, whether you're in an urban or a more rural setting. One real advantage is that these are great ways to achieve both climate mitigation and climate adaptation at the same time, particularly tree planting. Tree planting shade is in an urban and even in a natural rural setting like ours is really critical for dealing with increased temperatures and increased solar loading while sequestering carbon. Natural climate solutions, particularly restoration and of wetlands, of forests, of riparian areas, provides a number of non-climate co-benefits of wildlife habitat, recreation opportunities, even job creation, because we have to hire people to plant these trees and take care of them. As I mentioned before, this can work in both urban and rural settings. Urban, as Chris mentioned, the Urban Drawdown Initiative has thought about this quite a bit in the city setting, as well as what you've seen from Pitkin County and Route County today. This is a great way to promote community engagement in the climate action. It's a little hard to have people do energy efficiency retrofits and housing structures, but they can get involved in tree planting and restoration activities as volunteers. And a lot of these actions can be well within the purview of local governments, even if in the counties like the ones we've talked about here today with public lands managed by the federal government, the local governments can be a great partner in making things happen in those areas by thinking about cross-boundary management and engagement and partnerships. So those are my key takeaways for this, and I think we have time for questions now, so I'll turn it back over to Angela.
Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you to Chris and Erin. Those were fantastic presentations. So now we're going to open it up to questions. It looks like we had a few in the chat, and I think most of them were answered on the fly. We did have one question. Could you please cover the feedback you've gotten from agriculture or ag business stakeholders, including Farm Bureau and other rancher, farmer, and small business groups, from Don Stanton, a transportation commissioner? Chris did reply that specifically for their project. They received a number of ideas from those stakeholders, and he is happy to share some information summarizing that feedback. And then I took the question as well, sort of from the state perspective, and shared the Colorado Department of Agriculture's Cindy Lair, her email address there in that answer. Other folks can feel free to get in touch with her. She is CDA's point person on natural climate solutions, and really she'll have the best view of the feedback that they've received from CDA's perspective. I did participate in a scoping session we held on, well, we've actually held two on, one overarching, one on agriculture, but then two specific to the strategic plan development, one on grasslands and one on croplands. And we did have very thoughtful feedback from producers, from organizations representing producers. I think the state has been clear that they're taking an incentive-based approach here on the agricultural side. And then, so that's where we sit. We have also, though, heard, a lot of excitement from some producers about more innovative techniques or innovative technologies that they're interested in getting some public support for, in terms of implementing pilot projects. So we feel like we've had a really great interaction with that community so far, but we will welcome, any and all other comments. Let's see, there's also a question in the chat here from Lisa. Are there conservation organizations or land trusts in Colorado which are trying to identify lands to be best acquired and creating public-private partnerships to acquire them? So Chris responded to Commissioner Hickey, but yeah, he says yes, and that would be my response as well. And we're happy to put you in touch with the folks in that space. Tim, do you have any perspective?
Yeah, I think there is a very specific product from the Nature Conservancy that anyone thinking about this should look at. It's called the Resilient and Connected Lands Network. It's really an attempt to ask the question of which lands are most important for climate change resilience and maintaining corridors, connectivity, and also where are the areas of land that are most likely to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. So it's an amazing study. It's national, but there's a breakdown for Colorado, and you can look at it at a county by county level with very clear detail. So anyone trying to develop a conservation plan is well advised to look at that because it's specifically in the context of climate change and its impacts.
Great, thanks, Tim. All right, do we have any other questions? And feel free to unmute or put them in the chat.
Can I go back to the first question asked here, Angela? I mentioned it a bit in my talk, but it's a question that's really, I think, important for us to ask, because when we talk about one of the challenges, we know wildfire can emit quite a bit of carbon dioxide when it burns forests, but so does treating forests for addressing wildfire, right? We have to be taking land out of timber out of forests in order to reduce wildfire risk. How we do that matters, and I think we've given enough attention to that. One is obviously to find a way to use it in building materials that will have a long life. That's challenging in Colorado, particularly with dead timber. It's unlikely to be usable for that kind of timber construction, but it's worth looking at. Our current practice with a lot of the smaller timber is just to burn it in place, and I think that is a dangerous path forward if we're trying to reduce emissions. So how do you take that small timber and use it in different ways that don't just put it back up into the air? It's a really important question that we need to be paying more attention to, and one of the things we're looking at here in Route County.
Great, thanks for that, Tim. Any other questions from the attendees? Let's see, from Lisa, where could one find more information on soil amendments for carbon sequestration on grazing lands? We had a citizen ask about the application of basalt. Fascinating. Again, I would have to defer to the Colorado Department of Agriculture, but Tim or Chris, if you have other suggestions.
I have not heard about basalt being applied. That's an interesting one. This is an open area of interest. The Colorado State Extension is doing some tests right now on soil amendments on grazing land in western Colorado. So the Department of Agriculture would be a good place. Colorado State Extension out of CSU would be good. The most research that's being done on this is being done in California through an entity called the Marin Carbon Project. They've collected a lot of information on soil amendments in grazing land. Again, don't know about the application of basalt.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? All right. Well, I personally have to jump off to run to another meeting. So Carlin, I'm wondering if I can pass it along to you to close this out.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Angela.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
Tim and Chris and Erin, thanks so much for participating today in the webinar. It was very fascinating, everything you shared. So on behalf of the Colorado Resiliency Office, thanks for everyone who attended today. Stay tuned. I can't announce the next webinar yet, but please stay tuned for announcements for that. You can sign up for the newsletter on our website, as well as check the events page to find out about upcoming webinars. And once again, this has been recorded and we'll be posting it along with the presentations on the website. So you can check for that and share it with others. So with that, we will close this one out. Everyone have a wonderful day and thanks for joining. Bye-bye.